So today we're doing the second part of Esther, and we'll try to figure out or do as much as we can. The last we left off, Haman was in hot water because the king wanted to honor Mordecai, and if you remember, or Mordecai, if you remember, Haman was on the way to the Capitol building to tell Ahasuerus. Remember I was pronouncing the king Ahasuerus because there's no H in our English. When I talked to Rabbi Michael, he said, "Oh, did you talk about King Ahasuerus?" And I said, "Who?" He said, "Ahasuerus." And I said, "Oh, I've been mispronouncing it this whole time." But Haman was on the way to the king to really execute Mordecai. And Mordecai had already intercepted that and foiled Haman's plot to where, though the gallows were built, Haman had to parade Mordecai around the city. In chapter 7, we get to the request of Queen Esther and the king. So let's go ahead and read verse 1 and just talk briefly about a few things. Chapter 7, verse 1. So the king and Haman went in to feast with Queen Esther. On the second day, as they were drinking wine, the king again said to Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have won your favor, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me. That is my petition, the lives of my people." So here is a courageous, bold step of faith where she is basically now revealing that she is Jewish. Okay? For we have been, verse 4, "For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated." If you go to, let me see here, I think it's chapter 4, verse 13. Go to 4, let me see, 4, might be 15. Let's see here. Wait a minute. Yeah, it might be 3:14 actually. 3:13. If you go to chapter 3, verse 13, you're going to see that Haman's decree says this, 3:13. "Letters were sent by couriers to all king's provinces giving orders to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods." Okay? So go back to 7, verse 4. So Queen Esther basically recites the decree, okay? But what she's doing is she's saying, hey, that's me. That includes me. And you remember Ahasuerus really loved Esther. So now he has a decision to make. Verse 5, okay? "Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, 'Who is he and where is he who has presumed to do this?' And Esther said, 'A foe and enemy, this wicked Haman.' Then Haman," I heard that. No whistling. "Then Haman was terrified." I hear it. "Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The king rose from the feast in wrath and went into the palace garden, but Haman stayed to beg his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that the king had determined to destroy him. When the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman had thrown himself on the couch where Esther was reclining." I'm sure that's where we... Oh, yeah. Okay, "And the king said," as is verse 8, "Will he even assault the queen in my presence in my own house?" As the words left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs and attendants of the king, said, "Look, the very gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, stands at Haman's house, 50 cubits high." And the king said, "Hang him on that." So they hanged him. They hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the anger of the king abated. Okay? Questions, thoughts before we get to chapter 8? So, again, great reversal. Chapter 8. "On that day, King Ahasuerus gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, and Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her. Then the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. So Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Then Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet. weeping and pleading with him to avert the evil design of Haman the Agagite and the plot that he had devised against the Jews. The king held out the golden scepter to Esther, and Esther rose and stood before the king, and she said, "If it pleases the king, and I have won his favor, and if the thing seems right before the king, and I have his approval, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, which he wrote giving orders to destroy the Jews who are in all the provinces of the king." Okay, verse 7. We skip to verse 7. Then King Ahasuerus, said to Queen Esther and to the Jew Mordecai, "See, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he plotted to lay hands on the Jews. You may write as you please with regard to the Jews in the name of the king. Seal it with the king's ring for an edict written in the name of the king, and for an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked." So here's the problem. Haman's decree went throughout every province in the Persian Empire. That reaches from Asia Minor all the way to India, over 127 provinces. And because it's official, it cannot be revoked. So at that point, what Esther realizes, and Mordecai realizes, is that because they cannot revoke Haman's edict, in which the Jews are going to be annihilated on this one day, that they have to draw up a decree that gives the Jews the right to repel and to protect themselves and defend themselves on that day of the annihilation. So they can't revoke the decree, but they can write a decree giving Jews the right to protect themselves. Chapter 8, verse 11. Okay? By these letters, the king allowed the Jews who are in every city to assemble and to defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, with their children and women, and to plunder their goods. So the decree uses the same exact language as Haman's decree. And it gives the Jews the same exact parameters to destroy, to kill, to annihilate, both women and children. Any armed forces that would come up against the Jews. Talk about that in a minute. Verse 12. On a single day throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, a copy of the writ was to be issued as a decree in every province and published to all people, and the Jews were to be ready on that day to take revenge on their enemies. Stop there. My Bible has to take revenge on their enemies. The King James Version says to avenge. Did I get that right? To avenge. I have it written in. To inflict justice. So what does King James say?
Avenge themselves on their enemies.
To avenge themselves, I think that's NIV, but what is the King James, Mary Jo? To avenge? Okay, I thought it was to inflict justice. So what's interesting, I want to stop here. So the Jews are allowed to avenge themselves or to defend themselves. That's basically the bottom line. My Bible, my translation it says, and to take revenge, which is a mistranslation, and I have no idea why that's the case. But there's something else going on there. So let's talk about that, and this kind of gets in your notes. The word for avenge, okay, is a word that is used throughout the Old Testament, and I listed it here. So look at your notes. Negatively, it's used for Lamech in Genesis 4, where Lamech says, "I will take revenge," or "I will avenge anyone who does me harm." Lamech is a representative in Genesis for the cycle of violence and the extent of sin that happens after the fall. So Lamech is kind of like the model bad guy who says, "I will kill everyone who sheds blood." And so he uses the word avenge in that one. Neutral, it's used neutral in a neutral sense. When Samson is going up against the Philistines, it says that Samson avenges the Jews against the Philistines, also with Saul and the Philistines. So it's used in warfare when a marginalized people repel the majority force. Michael, is it possible you can turn the air on? They always cycle off after like 20 minutes. Thank you so much. It's also used in the legal code. Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy state that vengeance belongs to the Lord, and that the Lord will avenge and repel and defend Israel against all the enemies as long as they follow the rules. Okay? And then you see that in the next one, positively for God's defense of God's people and justice. And it gives you a list. The legal code gives people the right of protecting themselves. So, like, if it's like an eye for an eye kind of thing. And then it's also used in God's defense of God's people and justice. So for my Bible, I put revenge as an awful translation. But you get the sense here that though God is not in Esther, that the justice and the defense or the avenging that the Israelites do is grounded within the morality and the person of God, or at least the morality or legal codes of God's. It's basically it's precedent. Okay, so like when you go to a court of law, the lawyers look at precedent. So they're looking at precedent with the language that God would use to protect God's people, and they're writing this code, okay, or this decree. Again, they can't revoke Haman's decree, but they can repel it. And if you read the rest of chapter 8 and 9, they basically defend themselves and go from there. It's pretty violent. It turns pretty violent. Rabbi Michael from Temple Beth Shalom, everyone.
Now, you might be wondering why I'm wearing the goofy hat. Because it's Purim. Purim is one of our festivals. It's, and I'll talk about where it falls into time, but Purim is our dress-up holiday. Okay? That you are supposed to wear crazy outfits, right? You're supposed to dress up as the different people and the different characters. And so you will see people in all kinds of different costumes. What I didn't bring with me, unfortunately, is I didn't bring a flask. Because if it's really getting into Purim, while I was teaching and reading the Megillah, I would be drinking. Okay? I'll explain that in a minute. I did. They know all about it. Boy. I did bring with me, however, this is actually a Megillah. This is a scroll. Okay? And you can see it's in Hebrew, that it is illuminated. This is one of the texts that would have seen some illumination. Okay? And so this is one of the things that somebody, if you were celebrating Purim, which is in the spring, by the way, then you would be seeing something like this that people would be reading from. I'm not going to do that tonight. I only have 20 minutes, and it's quite the text. So, here it is in book form. I can't imagine, that's really, and it's in, Somebody will have to come tell me what language it's in. I'm not sure. Polish, maybe? All kinds of different things in the box. So, it is wonderful to be here. It is very strange to be here also, because what season is this? This is in fall, if you noticed. By the way, it's fall. That's what they call that up north when it gets a little bit cooler and the leaves fall out of the trees. So we are in the midst, I was actually a few minutes late because I was departing. We are in the midst of the festival of Sukkot, which is the festival of booths. And so we were having pizza in the hut. The kids were having a pizza party in our sukkah on our campus and celebrating the holiday of Sukkot, which is a harvest festival for the produce from the trees, and it's also the beginning of the rainy season in the land of Israel. The beginning of the dry season is a holiday you also might know called Passover. Have any ever heard of Passover? So if you're looking at the page, you'll see that Passover goes to Purim. And the way it works is this. Rosh Hashanah, which we just celebrated, is the Jewish New Year, but that's in the 7th month. Okay? How many of you start your calendar in the 7th month? Exactly. So in the land of Israel, spring was the beginning of the year. In Babylonia, the fall was the beginning of the year. And so we have Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, in this fall, but then we have the first month in the spring. It keeps it really interesting. Judaism answers everything with as many different answers all at once. So, Passover is one of those places of a beginning of a cycle, and it's very much the beginning of our holiday cycle. So, you have Passover. How much is God mentioned in the book, in the story of Passover? How much? A lot or a little? A lot. God is all over Passover. God brings plagues. God talks to Abraham. I promise it was just pizza I was eating. God talks to Moses. God talks to the people of Israel. God makes the sea split. God is all over the celebration of Passover. However, so that's the beginning of the year. And then we go all the way through all of our different holiday cycles, right? So you have Passover, the people of Israel get out of Egypt. 50 days later, Pentecost, people of Israel arrive at Mount Sinai and God gives Torah. And then they go wandering in the wilderness, and that leads us to Sukkot, because that's in part when the people are wandering in the wilderness and God took care of them for 40 years. That's one of the things we also do with the celebration of Sukkot. And then we go all the way back, and we're coming back into spring, into this time of Purim. How much is God mentioned in the book of Esther? None. It's all about humans trying to connect with the divine as they are going through these very human experiences. The book of Esther is incredibly political and social and power and relationship and court intrigue and kings that can't sleep. I mean, think about that one. How many of you read a book in order to fall asleep at night? How many of you think the king has to read, can't fall asleep at night? And what does he do? He gets a book of the deeds that are done on his behalf so he can fall asleep. That's a Ahasuerus for you. He was a silly guy. Did you all notice, why did Ahasuerus get rid of Queen Vashti? Did you all cover that?
A little bit. Yeah.
Because she wouldn't dance naked.
Because she would not dance naked. And then there's all sorts of commentary that, in fact, she might have been a descendant of Nebuchadnezzar, of the king of Babylon, and that might have been what it was. The suggestion of his advisors was, if your wife doesn't listen to you, then our wives might not listen to us, and therefore you have to get rid of the queen. Think of the absurdity of that kind of instruction. Okay, so there is suggestion that Esther is satire and farce. There is no record in Persia of a king named Ahasuerus. There's no record of anybody named Mordecai or Esther. All we have them is in the biblical record, and there's a lot of question of whether it really is a historical book, or is this a metaphor for experience? This is a story that is told as a way of gaining insight. So you've got Passover with God super present, and we get to the end of the year. And by the way, Passover is very serious, very thoughtful. It has its elements of play, but it's also an incredibly serious and powerful story. Then you have Purim. How do we celebrate Purim? With costumes, with noisemakers, and booze. How many cups of wine are you supposed to drink on Passover?
Can I buy grog? Can I buy grog?
There's a lot of overlap of all sorts of interesting things. On Passover, you're supposed to drink 4 cups of wine. Okay, on Passover. But 4 cups, just need a little bit. But it's measured out over the course of the night. With Purim, l'chaim, y'all. Okay? Yes?
I just found it about drinking alcohol on Purim. It said that a person has to get drunk until he cannot distinguish between cursed is Haman and blessed is.
Yes, that's correct. You're supposed to get so inebriated that you can't tell the difference between the hero and the villain. Okay? It's a wild, holiday. It is a crazy holiday. You should see it in Jerusalem, folks. It's amazing. As a 12-year-old. Oy. It's more interesting as a 22-year-old. So, God is very present in Passover. You drink alcohol, but it's very measured and set. With Purim, anything goes. It's a satire. It's a farce. You're supposed to dress up. You're drinking. Okay? And God isn't there. You have to be able to bring God through. And so that's a big part of Judaism, is that you go from one state, one experience, one way of looking at the world, and then you go to the polar opposite, and then you go back again. So you celebrate Purim, this joyous, frivolous, quite literally frivolous, playful, over-the-top, obnoxious holiday, and then 1 month later you get back to celebrating Passover. And so you get this interesting contrast as you move from a place where God is invisible, where they have to bring up God, where you have this over-the-top silly story, and then we get the incredible story of the Exodus. And that's just part of Judaism. We float back and forth between those kinds of things. You also see some of your central themes. One of the big themes is assimilation and inclusion, right? Esther and Mordecai fit in Persia until Haman says they don't. And it's always a huge challenge in Jewish life, and we'll get to that in just a second, of when do you fit in, when do you not? How long does the majority let a Jewish minority stay there and present and included? I grew up in Mississippi, okay? My parents moved there in the mid-70s, but in the mid-60s, something happened. In 1964 in Philadelphia, Mississippi. Who knows what happened there?
Freedom riders got killed.
You had 3 civil rights workers, 2 Jewish and 1 black, were murdered in Philadelphia, Mississippi. And shortly after that, in 67, you actually had the bombing of the synagogue in the rabbi's house in Jackson, my father's predecessor in Jackson. The Klan said that the Jews were part of the black minority, and the white Christians said, oh, they look white like us. But the pressure that came, because saying, wait, we think you're part of the minority, therefore we can attack you, kept increasing. And that was part of what was being experienced through the 60s and 50s, 60s, and 70s, even to when I was growing up in Mississippi. If you're a minority, it's how long do you get included, and how much do you have to assimilate into a majority before you get threatened, before someone tries to use that as leverage for power. Okay? And so then you have that whole story of how long can Esther hide? Esther has to hide her Judaism from Ahasuerus, right, in order to be in the court. And the other piece of it then is facing anti-Semitism, and I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. Now, I just told you there's alcohol involved, there's celebration involved, there's sex involved, there's political intrigue involved. But here's our challenge. If we want to tell the story to our kids, do you tell the G version, the rated G version, the PG version, or the rated R version? We do not tell the kids the rated R version. Okay? But you do that with the adults. So it becomes this question of what do we tell, how do we tell the story to who you're telling it to, what are the values you're going to take out of it? And you can see here on this page it talks about children's holiday, because we want to include our children in these stories in this holiday, versus that very adult story and those very adult themes. The whole interaction between Haman and Ahasuerus and Esther is really pretty incredible. And how do you also find that balance between the serious? It is a serious story. We see those power dynamics even to this very day. How do we feel and acknowledge that very serious stuff, even as you're drinking, even as you're making all kinds of awful and suggestive jokes, even as you're wearing costumes? How do you balance that ability to laugh at yourself and to laugh at the world and to laugh at the challenges, and then also really feel how do you have to take on some of those challenges? Now, and the last is the kind of one of the responses is that the story is so darn scary that I need to drink to read this stuff. Okay? that Jewish history gets so scary and challenging. If we really read the story straight up without a little bit of liquid courage, how do you laugh when you're tempted to cry and cry when you're tempted to laugh? And this is very much part of Jewish outlook and Jewish theology. You'll see here that and how am I doing time-wise?
Good, actually. You have about 8 minutes before you take questions.
Okay.
10 minutes before you take questions.
So you see there's a section here about scapegoating. This is from the very beginning of Exodus. So Joseph dies, all of his brothers, all that generation. But the Israelites were fertile and prolific. They multiplied and increased, they filled the land with them. And a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Remember, Joseph saved the people of Egypt when they had the famine in the land. Right? 7 years they stored everything. 7 years they had a famine. But Joseph had interpreted Pharaoh's dream. He saved Egypt. Now there's a Pharaoh, and we don't know if he didn't know the stories of Joseph, or he didn't care to include the stories of Joseph. But look what he says. Look. The Israelites are too much for us. Let us deal shrewdly with them so they might not increase. That's the first part. Then look at this tag. Otherwise, in the event of war, they may join our enemies and fight against us and rise from the ground. Oh, look, we've got a minority. They're getting lots of them around. That could be scary. And they might join with our enemies, so let's enslave them. Right? Yeah. There it is in Exodus, where you can see that experience of being a minority in a majority country, and here's a leader who is using it for his own political gain. That's the story of Passover. We know that happens also right there in the book of Esther. Now, if you look below that, you can see this repeat. So that's one of the themes. And that was, as Pastor Joe was asking me to come and speak with you, this is all about how you read it. I'm reading this because I'm Mordecai and Esther. I'm those Jews I'm a minority. There's one synagogue in Vero Beach, if you haven't noticed. How many churches are here?
150.
Berech, right? Approximately. There are a lot more Christians here. We are very much a minority. That's my experience. I hear people say that it's a Christian country. And I'm saying, look at the Constitution. There is no state religion. I want to have a place here. My ancestors came, my grandparents came here fleeing the Holocaust because this was a place where people of different religions can be included. And yet you feel that tension. That's part of the story for us. And then the second is that idea of constant threat. So this is from Deuteronomy. And get ready to boo. When you see the name that's crossed out, feel free to boo. Remember what Amalek did for you to your journey after you left Egypt, how undeterred by fear he surprised you on the march, when you were famished and weary and cut down all the stragglers in your rear. Therefore, when your God, the Eternal One, grants you safety from all your enemies around in the land that your God, the Eternal One, is giving you as a hereditary portion, you should blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven. Do not forget. I didn't bring the really loud grogger. So this is called a grogger, and it is a noisemaker. And everyone gets one on Purim. Okay? So you have a bunch of adults that are drinking alcohol and have lots of loud noisemakers. Just think about that for a minute. And part of Judaism is how do you move back and forth from those places where it's very serious and very thoughtful and respectful to where you're able to laugh at yourself, to laugh at God, to laugh at the world, to laugh at your experiences. A beautiful story about King Solomon that he wants a ring that can make a happy man sad and a sad man happy. Does anybody have that ring? No. It's a very simple ring that says Gamzel Avor, this too shall pass. And that's part of Judaism, is that we keep it always, and you see the reversals in the book of Esther quite a bit.